Always hold my fingers, cross them.
I was fixing to say, hold them or cross them.
Yeah, come on. See
Let's
what
do it.
happens. All right. Good deal. Okay. So reading this really does, this chapter kind of gives us a good overview of just what is involved in reading scripture. And when you read, when you're reading devotionally, how do you approach a text when you read it devotionally? Like you just picking up the Bible and reading it, like you would. Yeah, you just like if you're reading the Bible through in a year, you would have a section that you might have planned out for you, and you would read that section, but you're not really going to delve in to study it. You're just going to read it, okay? Because there's a difference between just reading, obviously, and what it is to really begin to connect everything. And that's why I applaud people for reading their Bible through in a year, and I applaud the publishers that mix it up, so that we get a little bit of everything because they know that we might get bored, but it really doesn't lend itself to study. So we're talking tonight about study. We're moving beyond just casually reading the Bible, which is a good thing. People that do that, I've got guys in the detention center that since January have read the Bible 4 times, and 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 I can tell the difference in the way they are uh, interacting with with the text. They're learning every time they read through it, but they really haven't developed any skill that's involved in study. So we're working on that with them. I'm giving them stuff. I'm giving them some of this, as a matter of fact, to kind of help them um, get more. Yeah, yeah,
This one is not, but I don't have a big enough bag to carry it.
right.
So I got a dance back to school.
Yeah,
And every time I read something, there's no footnotes. What? There's no
right.
application
Has nothing
or
to help you along. Yeah,
extensive
yeah,
scripture. You've got to report to go
yeah.
side by side.
So, what about the opportunity to create your own footnotes? And that's what really what we're trying to get to is being able to read and being able to go and mark your Bible or mark a passage and say, oh, this is what this said, or this is what it's referring to. I'm going to use a very simple example because most modern translations will translate the word walk for live, which is what it means in the Greek. So as you begin to learn words and learn how to put phrases together, you'll begin to develop some thoughts about that in your own mind that you'll jot down, and then you'll corroborate that with other passages of scripture, and it all begins to take shape in your mind, not just on the pages. Is where I guess is where I'm trying to get. Um, so let's look. They've got a. We're just going to go through example after example here because we're looking at on page 67. It's chapter 4 under things to look for in discourses. It talks about connections between paragraphs and episodes. So um, a lot of almost well all modern translations break things down into paragraphs, and then we see sections, subheadings a lot of times in our Bibles where it will describe an episode that happened. So Jesus feeding the 5,000, it'll block that out in the whole episode, but then there's paragraphs within that episode. How does all that connect? So it's often that paragraphs are connected um, by words, word phrases, by action, by all of these various things that we begin to use to build the story. So, or that is being used for us. We just have to pay attention to what's happening. So, Mark 8:22 through 26. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit in the man's eyes, and put his hands on him, Jesus said, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him on, saying, "Don't go into the village." All right, so we're going to look at that and find there's a lot of strange stuff here. Jesus does what? Jesus came to Bethsaida. The people brought the man to Jesus. Jesus leaves Bethsaida, takes him outside the town, spits in his eyes, makes his paste. He says, "Can you see anything?" And he says, "Well, I see people. They look like trees." So he touches his eyes again. And now he says that he opened his sight and he saw everything clearly. All right. And so Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't go back to those people." All right. So we look at all of that and it looks strange on the surface, right? What is Jesus doing? What is his purpose? So we look in the book and it says, taken by itself, the passage is strange. Why does Jesus only heal the man partially at first? Is he unable to heal the man, the blind person, completely all at once? Why does Jesus ask if the man can see anything? Doesn't he know? Is it uncertain about his healing ability? So these are all questions that could be asked, and people do ask. At first, the man can see nothing, then he can see partially, but not clearly. Finally, Jesus enables him to see clearly. Is there a point to all of this?
Well, there's gotta be, being as he was outside of the village, there wouldn't be a bunch of people standing around. So I'm not sure
Okay.
what that means. He's not seeing clearly, but is he seeing?
So we see the progression.
Yeah.
All right. We're not reading the story for the facts of the story. Okay. He is blind and he can't see. Then he can partially see. Okay. Then he can see clearly. At first it's, I can't see people clearly. Now I see everything clearly. Okay. So the reference to seeing changes through the story. Okay. So we can see just within that little episode that there is a progression. There's a progressive revelation that is happening in this man's life. All right. So let's look at the context right before it. All right. So this is why I say we generally look at, like, if a pastor's preaching, they're going to preach out of that section, and they're going to develop a sermon, or a lesson may develop out of that section. But the good preaching and good teaching is going to look at the broader context of that section and see how is it relating to what is immediately around it, because that's important too. We tend to read the Bible in bits and pieces because that's the way we read it and study it and that sort of thing. And if we don't pay attention to the broader context, we'll miss much of what the writer's trying to convey to us. Now, why do they write like this? Why don't they just come out and say it? Okay, it's a fair question. In our culture, we just want the facts, but in theirs, they want the story. They want to see how that is working in life. Okay, because they understood that if they were to ever understand God, they had to understand Him in life, not as some abstract, far off thing. So the writers, the gospel writers, under the leadership of the Holy Spirit, provide us with these great, they're not word studies so much as it's a practical means of discovering what is the work that Christ is doing overall. So let's look at the preceding portion, which is 14 through 21. So disciples had forgotten bread. You might remember this story.
Oh.
Okay. Except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. And Jesus says, "Be careful." Jesus warned them, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod." What's out of nowhere? This comes up, right? Really not out of nowhere, but They're there, and he warns them about yeast, which is what found in bread. They discuss this with one another. Is it because we have no bread? Okay, totally not seeing. They're totally blind to what is being said to them by Jesus. It's weird to say totally blind to what is being said, but they cannot perceive yet. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basket fulls of pieces did you pick up?" So he's reminding them what? If this was about bread, that's covered.
Yeah, that's been done.
Well, yeah, what are you talking about? So they don't see, and then here we have they say 12. They replied, "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. And he said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Okay, so they are seeing, but not clearly yet, right? All right, so let's look beyond that in verses 27 through 30. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On their way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." But then he says, "But what about you? Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. All right, so we have the disciples are not able to see, okay? Then we find in this passage that they are kind of seeing as it relates to what the people are understanding, but Jesus asks them a direct question about who they believe that he is, and Peter states clearly what he is perceiving Jesus to be. The same progression that we see with the blind man, right? I mean, with the blind man that he heals. He can't see. He begins to see a little bit more clearly, but he can't make it all out. And then finally, he does see clearly. And what does Jesus tell him? Don't go back into the village. You will become a caricature of something that really I am not. The world is not ready to know of me. Okay, and then he tells them the same thing. He says Jesus warned them not to tell anyone. He does this over and over in Mark's gospel, and sometimes it's called the secret gospel because he doesn't want anybody to know exactly who he is. And of course, every time he says that, everybody go run and blab. Yeah, so that what is clearly known is uncontainable. You have to share. That's kind of the message there. So, but if you read these in 3 separate sections, would you have picked up on the correlation between section 1 and section 3, and then the meaning of the whole blind man being thrown in the middle of that whole discussion? See, we don't really think about it in those terms when we don't study that way, when we don't read the Bible that way. So we're looking at this as connections between paragraphs and episodes. The middle section would be considered a paragraph material, but it's kind of its own episode. But it really doesn't. It's out of place because all it is communicating is something that was done for this man. Unless we begin to see, oh, this is more about revelation than it is about being healed. To see, and that makes perfect sense when we look at the 2 bookends on either side of it. Say, oh yeah, Jesus is pointing out that you're blind as bats about who I am and what I'm talking about with this yeast of the Pharisees. But over here, in just a very short period of time, you go from not understanding anything really about who Jesus is to Peter being able to say, "You're the Christ." Yeah. So this is how we learn to pay attention to Scripture. So we have to expand out. We get into into one section or the one paragraph, and we study it and we read it, and it's nice, something, you know, Oh, I remember that. I remember reading that when I was a kid. Is what usually happens. We kind of
Yeah.
repump. But when we're able to telescope, we've zoomed in. Now we're going to zoom out and absorb everything around it. And there's more to the story. This is true in so much of the Bible. Old Testament's the same way. You get zeroed in on one thing, and you may have to come out to the whole book to be able to see. Oh yeah, this is just a microcosm of what the whole excursion is about. See. Um, all right. Let's see. Now, if you follow what follows there, um, there's more to break down. I'm not going to go over all those since you have the book, and I'm so happy you have it. Um, but it gives you kind of an order of things. He saw, he looked, he saw, and all these different ways that seeing with eyes and all of that is brought together. And then Jesus even mentions, um, he mentions in that first section, uh, in the 41, he says, "Do you not, do you still not see or understand?" So that word "see," probably aracho in the Greek, which means to perceive. Okay. But it's surrounded by this episode of actually being able to see with your physical eyes. So, man, what a great object lesson, right? That's what Mark does here. He sandwiches the theological lesson with this great object lesson in the middle to illustrate that. Um, let's see. Let's go on. Let's look at the one in Colossians since we just got through going through all of this. No, we're not going to do that because hopefully I connected that for you when I was preaching it last couple of weeks or earlier in the month. All right, story shifts, major breaks and major pivots that happen within the passages or within the book itself. So when we look at he uses Ephesians here 1 through 3. Paul uses a large number of explanatory or descriptive types of words. There are almost no imperative verbs in chapter 1 through 3. So imperative means to act. Other verbs that are normally used are meant to instruct. Okay, so he's either describing an action of God or of someone else or as a means of instruction. So we look here in 1 through 3. Um, and this is what I mean by the shift. Who has blessed? He made known. You were dead. God made us alive. It is by grace you have been saved. God raised us up. He himself is our peace. This mystery is that through the gospel the Gentiles are heirs together with Israel. So he is all these verbs are what God is acting to do and a lot of them are passive to us. But then we get in the second part, beginning with 4:1, the verbs are predominantly imperatival. So be, meaning you are to be completely humble. You are to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do. You must put off falsehood. So there are instructions and it's given direction. So the foundation is laid in chapters 1 through 3. And so we know what God's up to. We know what's expected. And now we're in 4 and 5, and we know exactly what we're to do. So um, the letter as a whole presents everything we need. Now we generally gravitate to the imperatives because most of us want to know what we're supposed to do. We're still doers, and so we want to be able to do it right. Um, and so that's just another example of how, or an example of how in a passage things will shift and quite dramatically. But if you're not paying attention to the verbs, you don't really notice. So we're intimidated by that sometimes. I thought, oh, I got to know some English, but you really don't. The 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 whole feel of the passage changes. you can tell that Paul has directed his attention now and his focus into another part or aspect of the Christian life. He's no longer talking about God's work and unity of Gentiles and Jews together and those sorts of things, and all the work that God is doing in that, and the response that we have to that comes later. Okay, because God has done this, we need to behave in a certain way. We have opportunities to act and to do some things in a certain way. Um, okay, if you read in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, um, we see a pivot point in whose life? David's life. In 2 Samuel 11 and 12, we have the whole thing of David sleeping with Bathsheba and having Uriah killed. So everything previous to those two chapters, David's life is and it's smooth sailing. He's like the golden child. He's anointed by Samuel, and everything is going right. I mean, he defeats Goliath. He's a hero. He's even the king that wants to get rid of him can't. He's just too likable. He's too loving. He's just all of those things. But then he does this bonehead thing, and then when we look after that, David's life is a wreck. His children are a wreck. His family life's a wreck. His kingdom starts falling apart. He has to rely on his generals really to make decisions. He can't even make a decision. So we look at those particular points of shift in the broader story. Okay. Now, why is that important? I mean, we have to understand why Absalom was able to take over the kingdom from David by simply avenging the rape of his sister. Okay. How weak had David become? And it all goes back to this point. And it all moves us to a place where how is David the man after God's own heart? I mean, we know the story of David. We know all the things, but we look at this and we think, wait a minute. He did these two terrible things, and it did change everything about his life. But how is he still claiming to have a life near to God? It encourages us to seek more. So if you're reading let's say you're reading a mystery novel, and you come across part of that it doesn't make sense, or you weren't expecting that to happen. Okay, now you're going to begin to look what is going to result out of that. What has changed now in the story that hasn't been that way up to now? And we start reading with a different frame of mind. Or if you're reading along and you think you're following the main character, and then the author takes him out. Where do we go now? Well, what do we look for now? Well, that's some of what these pivot points do for us. David's got smooth sailing and he's the king, and then he does this stupid thing. Well, what's coming next? And we begin to look for those things, and more importantly, if God was in the first half, is God still going to be in the second half of David's life? And we start looking for God in a different way. Over here, everything's smooth sailing. So of course God's pleased, but over here it's not. So, we get to examine God in two different points of view. And we start looking, and then of course the grand prize is, how does that apply to me? You know, um, the principal facts that lead us from their town to our town. There's interchange is a literary device used primarily in a narrative that involves contrasting or comparing two stories at the same time as part of an overall story development. Usually, the narrative will move back and forth from one story to another to show the contrast. The Old Testament's full of this. If you were part of my Old Testament when we were doing some of those things, we stumbled across this stuff all the time. Um, Luke does it in Acts uh, with the central characters from Peter to Paul, and that whole thing happens over the Galatian controversy that I touched on this morning a little bit. But um, Paul has to call Peter out, and a portion of that is recorded in Acts, and we kind of see the tension and the shift that's going on there. Um, let's see. You could even take it. Well, I'm not. Well, we can go there. First Samuel talks about. Um, it involves Eli, the fat, lazy priest. It says here, and his two decadent, disobedient sons, Hophni and Phinehas, contrasted with devout Hannah and her pious, obedient son Samuel. So we talked about that when we were studying First and Second Samuel. That here we have who was supposed to be the anointed priest, and his sons who were making a mockery of everything that was the priesthood. Um, and then very quietly, God brings Samuel on the scene, and he's righteous and upright from the very beginning, and so is his mother. Not nothing like Eli. And so we see these contrasting and interchanging ideas between them because their lives cross paths. Okay, so we want to look at the contrasting nature as they are presented. So we don't get focused just on one thing, but we see the the collective whole of the passage. Um, the authors point out there the stories unfold at the same time, with the narrative moving back and forth from one another. As you read the narrative, look for the interchange between the two different stories, and that's what I'm talking about. So just go and there's some examples there to look up and to see. You can read them and see for yourself. Uh, chiasm I mentioned last week is a fascinating literary feature that is seldom used in English, but we don't ever use it. I've never seen it in English. Old Testament loves using this. So let's see this passage. Oh, he's illustrating this. Okay. So I got up in the morning, got dressed, drove to town. I worked hard all day, returned home, put on my PJs, and went to bed. So the chiastic structure would be I got up in the morning, A. B, I got dressed. C, I drove to town. D, I worked hard all day. That's the pivot point in the whole story. I did all of this so I could work hard all day.
Okay.
All right, I'm through working all day. So C1, I return home. B1, I put on my PJs, and A1, I went to bed. So they contrast each other. A, I got up. A1, I went to bed. B, I got dressed. B1, I got undressed, put on my PJs. C, I drove to town. I drove home. And then, so the passage points to the significant activity that all of this points to is that I got to work and I worked hard all day. So you find these. Uh,
It almost reminds me of Shakespeare, like Macbeth,
Mm.
because in the beginning of the book, Macbeth is given this prophecy that he's going to become the king of Scotland. You have the midpoint where he kills the king, assassinates him to become the next king.
right.
At the very end, he is killed, and you have a new king become the next in line.
Same thing.
So
Same thing. Yeah. Um, and so we get these in the Bible a lot, and they're not easy to spot. Sometimes they are easy to spot, but it was a very popular way that especially Hebrews writers would write, or even in the New Testament, if the writer is Hebrew, they use these chiastic structures.
Now, be able to maybe pick out.
Yeah,
say that in the New Testament you have the birth of Jesus
Oh,
and
yeah.
then the resurrection of Jesus.
very good.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And then there's A's and B's all the way through that up until, yeah. Yeah, that's definitely cool.
So we look for them, and why do we look for them? Because of D in this particular example. We want to find the focus, what the whole story is about. And some of these structures are chapters long. So you really have to if you're looking for this, what separates them mainly here is the verb action. Okay? So you begin to look for action And then sometimes you'll find them in prayers where they will say a particular series of statements about a thing that they are praying for, and then they'll repeat or back out of those statements the same way. So we find them in the Psalms like that, some pretty often. In a lot of narratives, we find it that way. One, oh, I got one that comes to mind when Jesus crosses the lake to heal the demoniac. Okay, he goes and he heals the demoniac. There's an interchange with the demoniac and Jesus. Um, he discovers the name. The man is healed um, because of an encounter with the pigs. Okay, so the man is healed. The pigs are cursed. The people in the town, their interaction with Jesus doesn't lead to healing. It leads to get out of our town. And then Jesus gets back in the boat and leaves. So the focal point of that episode is that the man is healed. Okay. Uh, Speaks to the demons. The man is healed. The demons speak to Jesus. The pigs are ran into they're possessed, is the way that I should be saying that. They're possessed. And then the townspeople response is leave town, and he leaves town. So it's got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step. Yeah. So you know the point really in some of those already, but they really are important to find because it does help connect big sections together. Okay. Uh, there's another one here.
This is books or cover span more than one book to
Well, no, it'll generally fall. Yeah.
within a short.
So what we have to remember that the writer is writing his particular text
Okay.
with these things in it. So we won't have to look real far. We may have to look over 2 or 3 chapters to
Okay.
get the whole structure.
All right.
So here's one in Genesis. If you see Genesis 11, 1 through 9 there, he gives the passage and he breaks it down chiastically. And we find that the focus of this particular passage is that the Lord came down. They were trying to reach up to God, but the Lord came down. And we see on either side of that what happens. They say, "Come, let us make bricks," and then God comes down and tears it all down. Okay. Um, so you can look at the passage. The passage is over on the previous page, and then the chiasm is there on that particular page. Now, when we look, all right, so does all that make sense? I know we're doing a lot at once here.
Struggling with that.
Yeah.
What I'm gonna get, I'll get the rest out.
We'll see.
Is more understanding, not that I can see it.
Yeah.
You know, I have to try to use it
Yeah.
function doing it, but it makes sense.
So we find in these like the illustration with Jesus and the blind man, we find a recurring theme of that, but it's not perfectly clear. So we read that first section and we look at it and we think, man, these disciples are not very bright. And we would stay there and conclude, man, Jesus must have been really frustrated to have to deal with these guys every day, not being able to see what he was about. But that's not the point of the story. The point is not to walk away saying, oh, these guys are, they can't figure anything out. So, but that's where we're left in that one part of the story because Jesus said, you don't understand any of this. You still think I'm talking about bread. But then Mark provides for us in the middle of that the story of the healing of the man that's blind. And if we're paying attention, we say, well, this man is now able to see because of Jesus. Disciples weren't. And then we read the next section and some bells should be going off if we're reading for the meaning of the passage rather than just for what the story is saying. That makes sense.
Yes.
It does.
The writers always, whenever there's a story like that, there's always something else going on. Okay. So we want to learn to read those. We're going to look at some here.
Do that. It's you showing me what you're showing me now, so I can look past
Yeah.
what just the one episode is.
And different things happen. So in that first section, let's just take this for instance. For instance, in that first section, there's some tension between Jesus and his disciples. They're not getting it. How frustrating it is for them too, for Jesus, but for them too. Oh man, we forgot the bread. He's worried about bread. You know, and Jesus is listening to all this and said, I make bread in jumbo amounts. Well, what are you worried about the bread for? Okay. And so we get to that and we're thinking, man, there's got to be more to this than this. And so we begin to look. Okay. Um, let's think of what's another one with Jesus that may come to mind where, um, oh, I'm trying to think of one. Oh, they're walking along and they're talking about uh, Jesus, when you go into your kingdom, we want to be on your right hand and your left hand. Why? Why are they asking that question? What makes John and James so special that they think that they can ask for such a thing? Okay. And so we hear this and we hear the arrogance of it, and everybody else gets mad about it. All the other disciples, because they hear them, and they're mad about it, thinking that they're so much better than the rest of them. And so in that, uh, there's a pivot. There's a pivot because Jesus says, "You don't know what you're asking to be on my right hand and my left." So besides, my Father gets to decide that. So you're asking for things way out of your league. But what does he do? He pivots from this very negative presentation by James and John about the whole structure of being what it means to be a disciple of Jesus and who's going to be favored and all of this. Jesus uses that whole thing and he pivots and he says, "I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give my life." So now, without saying anything about what's about to happen with him, he doesn't have to spell it all out, but we see it. We're not allowed for the disciples' response because we're led to believe they just had to really mull it over. That this thing that they're on now, it's not about greatness. It's not about being at the right or the left. This is about being a servant, and this is possibly about giving our lives up. And so everything shifts. Okay. So we get all irritated with James and John because they're so arrogant. No, no.
Okay.
John and James were brothers, the sons of thunder.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So we have that going on, and then Jesus takes this perfect opportunity to pivot and make it about something totally what they weren't expecting.
Thinking they were still expecting Jesus to be the earthly king.
Right,
And they wanted those worships because,
Right.
well, hey, you know what? We got the king. We're on his good side.
Yeah.
Let's get a little piece for ourselves.
that's exactly right. And this is late in the day for
Mhm.
Jesus and his disciples, and they still aren't getting it. Yeah, but it's a beautiful passage because he pivots away from their egotistical concerns and turns it back on. If you're going to do this with me, selflessness is the only way because I'm about to die for all of you. The most selfless act ever. Um, so we learn to read this way because really it allows us to it should allow us to look at our own lives a bit differently. That's the whole point, anyway. Is to be able to understand Jesus more and understand our relationship to him more through scripture or God, of course. Um, So anyway, this is how we do it. So on page 81, there's a long passage, Mark 5:21 through 43. This is a story about Jairus' daughter. Remember the story? Jesus is called to Jairus' house, and on the way, the woman touches him. The woman has a discharge of blood. Okay, and Jesus is very hurried. Uh, Trip to Jairus' house is interrupted by this woman. Okay, and then while he is dealing with her, some people come and say your daughter is dead. All right, and so why bother the teacher anymore? So there's something that hasn't been revealed in this passage until that statement. Why bother him? This whole thing is a bother. So we look, oh man, Jairus is bothering, this woman is bothering, and the result of that bother is that this poor girl has died. And what does Jesus do? He said, ignoring what they said, Jesus told the ruler, don't be afraid, just believe. So if you had to focus in fact, I don't know if this is a passage that you're looking at, or they're not. So he goes on. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. He went, when they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. Okay, he went in and said to them, what's all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. And they all laughed at him. Okay, so we've got this very public healing of this woman, and they're all amazed at what he said. Then we've got this very private moment here with Jairus' daughter, and the ones that are there are laughing. And so Jesus removes himself even further. Okay? But he pulled them all out. He took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took the girl by the hand and said, Talitha Kaum, which means little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. Mark loves that stuff. uh, he loves putting in those little details. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and he told them to give her something to eat. Oh, say, okay. So, man, there's so much going on here, huh? You could start two columns. In fact, he does this on the next page, where it says Jairus and the bleeding woman, and you can go through and just do a side by side comparison of everything that you can think of there. And you begin to uncover all sorts of things. Okay. Um, and when we do that, when these stories are interlaced, you can't pull them apart and get the whole meaning that is being conveyed by Mark by putting them together. Okay. Makes sense? So if you were to preach this or teach this, you have to teach them or preach them together because they speak to one another. Yeah. So how do they speak? Okay. The boldness of the woman, she is not worried about bothering Jesus. She's going to reach out and do something she should never do. And she does it. And she thinks that she's going to get away with it privately, but she doesn't. It's all very public. Who touched me?
If she doesn't lie or try to
No.
cover it up, she comes
No. Yeah. And yeah, what would have been her value in lying? She reached to touch the man. I mean, if he can heal her, surely he knows what's true. Yeah. And well, when you read this, you see the people crowding against you when he asked, who touched me? And yet you ask, who touched you? It's like, how do you expect us to know who touched you? But that he wasn't asking the question like that, of course. What is he wanting to do? He's not going to waste it. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
and for the people to see. She's
So you can go through find 100 things here. Yeah. Um, then the woman knew what had happened, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Okay, so her faith has healed her. Immediately, the servants of Jairus's house come up and say, She's dead. Don't bother this guy anymore. Okay, so they had a faith in Jesus as long as the girl was sick, but when she died, it was gone. Don't bother him anymore. He can't do anything. Okay, so you take the smaller miracle that happens in the middle of the story, and it expands out into life-giving miracle. Both really giving life to the woman that she never had, and life to the little girl, who Jesus says really didn't die at all. She's just asleep. Um, so anyway, you can go through and compare all of those, and it makes for good study, and it exposes us to a deeper understanding of the connected parts of the story. Any other comments about that?
the
Yeah,
this makes no sense.
yeah,
But it had these tools to go by and
right,
connected with everything. You can see the bigger point. You can see the A and B and so forth.
right.
I think it's I think it's rather especially telling in 34 when the woman touches him, he turns to her and addresses her as daughter, and yet
Yeah.
Jairus has the same relationship. His daughter is the one who needs help.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, so we begin to break this stuff down like that. And the comparisons and the way that they contrast with one another. Um, and then we find in this that nothing has rattled Jesus through the whole thing. He is an a clear vision of the whole scene all the way through. Everyone else is questioning. The disciples question, the Jairus' servants, they're not questioning out loud, but they're saying there's nothing he can do. I mean, there's no way that he can do anything now. She's dead. They question him by laughing at him for saying that she's not dead. I don't believe.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I
this is
think that.
before Lazarus.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's some scholarly discussion about whether or not this was the same. Yeah. So we're going through that synoptically on Wednesdays, and when we get that, I'm kind of eager to see. I haven't really done a lot of study in that. Yeah, so there's a lot of questioning Jesus's veracity and all of these things, and he always comes through. And then Mark even adds details to remind us that he's always concerned with the details. He never overlooks the details. So he tells him to get him something to eat. Don't let this little girl just walk around here without getting her something to eat. We got to get her something to eat. You know. So Mark makes sure that we understand that, and he puts this quote in here. So to remind us that he just tells her to get up. That everything he says about uh, death having escaped her is true. He's just gone in there and got her up. But who knows it? Not the crowds. He goes in there with the mother and the father and Peter, James, and John, and they get to experience what? What makes this? What makes this important? What makes this moment important that it is private? Why was it important that the woman's be public? Okay, so the woman, she'd had this discharge of blood for how long? Years. And so we know from Mosaic law that what does that make her?
Unclean.
Unclean. And so the unclean reaches out and touches the clean. That was a terrible thing to do. But Jesus doesn't scold her about it. Yeah. He just wants to know who did it. Because of what? Her faith. Okay? So in this very public way, healing occurs. There's no condemnation. And it all is because she had a great faith in Jesus. And he gives testimony to everyone around. Okay? Then in this next episode, it's all very private. Jesus touches the one believed to be dead, which you're not supposed to do.
Oh, that's right. That's unclean
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. So what is he saying? What is happening here? Okay, he's already said she's not dead, but they know that, they believe that she's dead,
Yeah.
and she probably was dead. They've been around death their whole life. What was Jesus saying when she's not dead? Okay? As long as I'm here, she's not dead. So very privately he goes and he touches what he should not touch and provides life to a thing that should not have life. And the result is what? She stands up and what? She dances. Yeah. It's exuberant. She's walking around. Yeah, the Greek gives us a little more about what it means that she's walking around. It really does have more to do with dancing. So she gets up and walks, and everything's fine now. Okay, and she's going to come out of the room, and she's going to sit down and have a meal. Okay, and everyone, including the people that once were laughing, are now astonished. Later in the gospel story, we see that there's another time where a person is raised from the dead. And he says, "Hey, give me something to eat." Who was that? That was Jesus. It's like his mind went back to the little girl and said, "Oh, yeah, I need something to eat too." I mean, that's been an ordeal we've been through here. Uh, you know, so we know that Jesus died and was raised. So we get a little hint. So this is just a question. Does Mark foreshadow Jesus by providing us with this story of Jairus and his daughter when no one believed that she would be raised, and yet she was raised?
I would think so, because this is all written after the fact. So if he's going back and writing all of this, he probably is alluding to
Yeah.
what's to come.
Now Mark never goes into that in his gospel. He never goes into Jesus being raised, but Luke
Right.
does. Okay? And Luke had Mark as a source.
Yes.
All right? So Luke is looking at the story of the little girl and he's saying, "Oh, here it is." This is a way for the Hebrew writer, Mark, to take the small thing and Luke takes it and expands it into the bigger thing. Okay? So when we look at, well, that's Matthew's gospel, or that's Luke's gospel. It's God's gospel. He takes all of these things and we knit them together in ways that the three of them could have never done without divine leadership in their life to bring all this about. So there's 100 things to learn in the story, and then there's the big thing that we often may not see. That, and Jesus is a life that overcomes death, and we celebrate that. And Jesus celebrated it, and the rest of the world looks astonished at it. Mm-hmm.
This is going to happen. Did they go run out and tell him that the daughter was alive?
Well,
Instances.
yeah,
That's up and go and tell.
yeah. It doesn't say that they ran and told here, but he told them not to let anyone know about this. So the they is the closest they to the or the they is closest to Peter, James, John, and the parents. Okay, they're not to tell anyone, but there's mourners in the house. Because when he gets there, they're all mourning and wailing. Okay. So they may not tell anyone, but the little girl's got to come out of the room. So it could be that when it says they, it could mean everyone that was there. And he told them all not to say anything.
Yeah.
Very often in Mark's gospel, Jesus says that and they all go blab. They tell.
And another contrast would be the fact that the one in the streets is one of the common people. These are the throngs of the regular,
Yeah.
That's right.
everyday citizens. Whereas with Jairus, he is they call him the ruler of the synagogue. So he's upper class. He's obviously got some to do with the establishment. And part of me imagines when he shows up to see Jesus, he's probably got a cloak over his face so that no one can see him because, well, here's our synagogue ruler. And
Right.
he's going to find this, street preacher.
Yeah.
Take care of.
Yeah.
Here's another thing
Shot
in
to the
that.
system.
Who would have enforced the law over the woman with the blood? The chairman of the synagogue. His job, oddly enough, was to remind her constantly, you're unclean, according to the law of Moses. Okay, so everything about Jairus' life changed today. Okay, because no longer is it the law that determines who is clean and unclean. It's Jesus. It's no longer death that decides who's dead or alive. It's Jesus. And Jairus is experiencing all of this. And by the time his little girl sat down to eat, imagine his head was spinning. Because he's thinking Jesus, first of all, he's thinking Jesus wasted his time on this woman who is unclean.
Yep.
But then when the story's over, it turns out that Jesus didn't waste a thing. So,
He
all,
didn't say anything.
no. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff here, see? You can go forever with this stuff. You can preach this passage about 19 different ways if you want to. And all of it be good, right, and true. And the truth is, you can't get to all of them in one sermon. You'll drive yourself crazy trying to make a salient point. Yeah.
The whole Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
You do it this episode right here. It's enough to talk about forever.
Yeah.
Next time. Before moving on.
Yeah. Richard Foster, who wrote The Spirit of Celebration of the Disciplines, he would pick a passage like this and he may read it every day for a year and just work it. Yeah. Yeah. So part of doing this is developing the discipline to just sit down. William Hendricks says a piece of paper and a pen is a crowbar for the mind. You just lay those things, you just begin to write all those things and you'll begin to see more and more is released out of it. So we want to be able to do that. Yeah. Alrighty, adios. Time's up.
Just when I'm starting to grasp some of